if you're thinking about migration, you want to travel overseas, you want to live overseas, and you're looking at Australia or New Zealand, and you're undecided about which country, well, this video is for you. Now, you're probably hearing some mixed information out there. Some people say it's easy, some people it's hard. Everyone's got their opinion about which country might be easier or harder for various things. So in this video, I'm going to give you guys a realistic overview of the current migration landscape in both countries, New Zealand and Australia, and what you actually need to know before making any decisions. So I'm David, I'm an immigration lawyer. I'm practicing in both New Zealand and Australia. And in this video, we're going to talk about a number of topics. Now, I don't like scripts. My staff give me a script like this with all the notes. Basically, what we're going to talk about today is the current migration temperature, the reality of 2026, the reality of work visas in both New Zealand and Australia, what it's really like working in those two countries. What does skilled really mean when we talk about skilled migration? We're going to talk about realistic pathway strategies in both countries, student visas, what it's like to actually study and how that works as a pathway. I'm going to talk about the general pathways through work in both countries independently. I'm going to talk about the key differences between these two countries, the costs, the time, and a reality check, and hopefully you'll get something out of this. Now, what is the reality of migration in these two countries, New Zealand and Australia, in 2026? What's really going on? We've come out of quite a turbulent time with COVID-19. Australia had a long-term extension of temporary visas throughout COVID, which allowed people to stay longer. New Zealand actually granted residence to over 100,000 people who were in New Zealand and working at the time. And so this created a kind of a spike, which has then, of course, settled, and now we're coming into a sort of a new landscape. 2026 is a bit different than 2025. So in Australia, what we're seeing, for example, is tighter control around certain visa categories, okay? Particularly student visas, where there's a much higher level of scrutiny than there has been in the past. We're seeing a lot more declines from certain types of countries as well. On the other hand, New Zealand is not necessarily open in the sense that New Zealand accepts everyone and everyone's approved. But often for those who successfully do obtain something like a student visa or a certain qualification they're going for, have a little bit more of a clearer pathway towards a permanent stay. That being said, it's important to understand that New Zealand especially is a very small country, and even Australia being large geographically, it's not as big in terms of population like the United States. And so we are, as these two island nations, still very strict when assessing genuine intentions and your genuine pathways and plans to migrate. So what's the work visa reality? Okay, because work visas are, essentially sort of the general, I suppose you could say working is the purpose that New Zealand wants you to do in New Zealand. Most residence categories are based on employment, let's face it. So when it comes to work visas, everyone in the world is looking for skilled migrants. There's actually quite a competition, if you think about it, between countries, the Western countries especially, but to get skilled migrants. We're looking for people at higher levels of value in the economy, so to speak. So it's not so straightforward. Now, in New Zealand, for example, an employer, well, in both countries actually, but we'll talk about New Zealand first. The employer usually has to show to Immigration New Zealand that they've tried to hire locally, they couldn't find suitable candidates, and then only then they can really support a migrant worker. You can apply for what's called an accredited employer work visa. This is the employer-sponsored work visa, and generally speaking, there's no such thing as a work visa in New Zealand unless you have a job offer. When it comes to these employer-sponsored work visas, you need a job offer. The job offer is central to being able to work. And similarly with Australia, the employer-sponsored streams, it's not really the case that you can just say, oh, I want to work in Australia, can I just go over there and work? No, you can't. Whereas with residents, potentially if you satisfy the points criteria, you don't necessarily have to have a job offer, but for work visas, you always do. Because keep this in mind, the work visa is instigated by the employers. We start by focusing on the needs of the country through firms and companies that need workers. So those companies have needs for workers, then they instigate the process to attract migrant labor. In practice, of course, the demand comes from the other side. People like the viewers watching this who want to move overseas. So there needs to be a kind of a matching of those two things, but the key point is that it's employer focused. Now, when you're talking about being eligible for a work visa or residence, we often use this expression skilled, right? So skilled migration, the skilled migrant category in New Zealand. So what does skilled mean? Now, there's a misconception about skilled, because people will say, well, look, obviously I'm skilled. I've got 20 years experience. I've been doing, whatever your job may be, for a really long time, and I've got diplomas and certificates and qualifications back home. But here's the thing, from an immigration perspective, we need to look at whether you've been working in a comparable labour market. So, for example, if you come from the United Kingdom and you've worked for 20 years as a carpenter, well, both New Zealand and Australia are likely, and employers are likely to look at that and say, okay, wonderful, this is a comparable labour market to our home market. So those employers will recognise that skill, and in many of the visa categories, that skill can be recognised as well. But if you've been working as a carpenter in, let's just say, a village somewhere in Southeast Asia, I don't want to say one country, it doesn't necessarily matter, but let's just say it's a market where it's a totally different scenario, not as much regulation, not as many formal qualifications required. We would look at that, employers would look at that and say, okay, you might have lots of experience, but we can't necessarily trust that experience on the face of it, because the country and the location where you've been working doesn't match with the types of working environment that we have. So it's really important to look at whether the skills that you have are actually recognised within the country you're looking at, whether they're in demand, and whether they're supported by qualifications or licensing. Licensing, for example, and registration for if you're a doctor, pharmacist, lawyer, plumber, you most likely will need to be registered for those occupations in New Zealand or Australia, and so it's not the case that you can just claim to be experienced and then apply for the visa. You need to go through these registration processes first as well. So it complicates things, right? Now let's talk about a realistic pathway strategy and what that looks like. Okay, so the most ideal and cost-effective strategy and pathway to migrate into a new country like New Zealand or Australia is to secure that job offer, but that's often really hard to do, right? You might not be able to secure employment from offshore. You might need to come into the country first, which also is not necessarily possible for everybody. For example, if I was speaking yesterday with a chef, and as a chef and with experience in many different types of restaurants and hotels around the world, he would likely be suitable to work in New Zealand. But he was expressing how no one's willing to hire him by Zoom interview, right? So of course we need to look at getting him into the country to find an employment. So when we talk about this as a cost-effective pathway, it's not necessarily the most realistic for everybody, okay? Because of course, you can try applying for jobs, every day, but if it's not successful, it just can't work. So then, of course, in terms of being realistic, you might need to consider whether there's a way to get into the country first, and that's often through studying, student visas. Now, the student visa pathway, on the other hand, it's potentially a high-risk pathway if it's misused. Okay, it's very, very practical because you can get into the country, you get local qualifications. Then you often will have working rights and post-study working rights, so you can gain local experience. But the tricky part is number one, proving that you're a genuine student and that you're not just using student visa pathways to get out of your home country. But also number two, that it's fraught with difficulty because the offshore education agent system is not regulated or controlled by our regulatory bodies in New Zealand and Australia. To a degree, there are controls and connections in place with the university providers and everything. But let's face it, if you're in a country, let's say you're in the Indian subcontinent, and it's very common that you'll go to a local student agent and you say to them, hey, I'd like to go overseas, what can I do? Well, their job is to sell you to the college providers, the universities and the schools, right? You are the product for them. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. They won't charge you any money because they're getting paid from the schools. I'm not saying that's bad. They have skills and knowledge about education advice, but they're also, there's a tendency to overinflate, the possibilities for it. They'll say the streets are paved with gold, so to speak, as people say. Yeah, you can study this one and you'll get PR, no problem. There are jobs in this country for you, right? And so you should not really believe what they say. And, interestingly enough, we're starting to see even organizations popping up claiming to be some kind of education authority for New Zealand, when in reality it's a private company trying to drum up business, and they create a sort of a fake authority image. So now when you go to an offshore education agent, they have a little badge maybe that says, I'm licensed by this authority. Well, there's no such thing as a license for an educational authority in New Zealand. So if you see that, you might think, oh wow, this person's really knowledgeable. Meanwhile, nothing's changed. They are selling you to the colleges to get commissions. So you have to be really careful what you do in terms of what you choose, which pathway, which education provider, which country you go to. And this is where we always say, look, be really careful about free advice. If you go to the free advice and choose the cheapest course, you may just enter into a long-term program without proper long-term planning. So this is why I say the student visa pathway is actually a really high-risk proposition if it's misused. But it's a great proposition if you do it right, okay? Give you an example. In New Zealand, if you come here and you study a master's degree, if you're eligible for a master's degree, and if you've already got a bachelor's degree from offshore, you do a master's in New Zealand, you'll get a 3-year post-study work visa at the end of it. And if you're doing the right type of course that matches with the New Zealand landscape of work and the labour market, you find a job and you could be potentially eligible for residency straight away, right? It sounds so simple. It's obviously a bit more complex than that, but just an example for you. Okay, let's talk about general pathways for New Zealand and general pathways for Australia, and the key differences between those two countries, so you can understand a bit of the landscape of what it looks like. So in New Zealand, we have, for work visa pathways, generally speaking, it's the accredited employer work visa. The accredited employer work visa is where the employer has to be accredited. They then go and prove that they can't find New Zealanders to do the job. They get a token, you use that token, you apply for the visa. It's sort of a 3-step process. In terms of residence, the skilled residence pathways are the skilled migrant category. It's a points-based system. There's a straight to residence option for specific occupations if you meet the requirements, when you can apply directly for residence, no points required. And then there's obviously partnership as well. You can apply based on being a partner of a New Zealander. These are kind of the core types of ways to get into the country, along with student visas. In Australia, the employer-sponsored visas, there's a number of them, and this is to do with sponsorship and nomination. Now it's a lot more expensive over there, but it's a similar kind of process. Of course, the employer has to demonstrate that they're not able to recruit from the local labour market. One of the key differences that in Australia, there's also fees and levies on top of immigration process to balance the local labour market. Skilled migration in Australia is a points-based system as well. A key difference with Australia is that there's the potential that you can achieve the points and be selected and apply for and be approved your permanent residence application without an employer. Okay, so in New Zealand, you must have an employer. It's a fundamental requirement. If you don't have an employer, there is no skilled pathway for you to residence. In Australia, potentially there is. Okay, Australia views that differently. And I guess if you think about it, it makes sense that the argument for New Zealand as well, if we want to give you a resident visa based on your qualifications, experience and employment, you should have a job. But in reality, once you've been approved for your residence, you don't really have to stay in the job, okay? You're supposed to intend to stay in the job. You can't just apply and intend to never work there. Of course, if they know that to be true, they won't approve you. But once you've been approved, you can move on. You don't have to work there. So in Australia, they recognize that and they say, well, look, we just want the people who have those skills and occupations. So if you can demonstrate that you are that person, we'll approve you, and we just assume that it's likely that you'll find a similar type of level of job once you're in the country. That sort of ties into what really is one of the big key differences between New Zealand and Australia is simply the size and scope. Australia can afford to have those types of open policies in that way because it's a much larger country, a much larger workforce, economy, everything. If you think about it, the New Zealand being a smaller country means that there are more targeted immigration needs, whereas in Australia, because it's a larger country, they sort of have a much broader scope of what they're targeting. Now, the other key difference, of course, is because of that size, Australia has a much more complex system, okay? This is something that's really important to keep in mind when you're talking to professionals. Now, if you come to us in my company and you're talking about New Zealand, anyone in my company who's licensed or a lawyer will be able to talk to you about almost any aspect of immigration practice. To some degree, there are specializations, right? But generally speaking, the landscape of immigration practice in New Zealand it's a one state, right? One country, one state, one policy. Whereas in Australia, if you come to us to talk about Australia, well, depending on what your inquiry is about, we will point you to the right person because we need to specialize in different areas. There are there are multiple states, therefore there are federal programs, state programs, area programs. There are different things you can put in place like labor agreements. There's a thing called DAMA agreements, designated migration area agreements. And it's just so complex, right? So it's not really possible that you just find someone who's registered as an agent, contact them and ask them a question, and that they'll be able to give you a complete comprehensive picture. And because of that, we see that, I would say that New Zealand is, in a sense, it's a little bit, you can have a little bit more clarity about your migration pathway with New Zealand. Whereas with Australia, it's a bit harder to become eligible for something. Often we hear of people staying in Australia for many, many years, trying this, trying that, hopping from different visa, getting different advice, struggling to be approved in the end, and then when they come to New Zealand, it happens much more quickly. That's one of the bigger differences as well. Look, the other thing we see is why people would choose Australia over New Zealand when I've just said that potentially New Zealand is, not easier, but maybe a little bit more clear, is Australia is, there's more money there. Let's face it, the job market is just bigger. Look, we hear anecdotally stories of people landing in Sydney on a working holiday visa, and within 24 hours they're working in a restaurant earning $35 an hour as a waiter, right? Washing dishes even, okay? Because in Australia they have this thing called the awards, industry award rules, and what that means is that if you're working in a particular industry, there's a kind of agreement in place with the industry representatives and industry bodies, and therefore the state government enforces that you have to pay people at a certain rate for certain types of employment, that there are minimum standards. And just as an example, a casual rate for a fast food worker in Melbourne would be over $30 an hour. Now, New Zealand, on the other hand, we have minimum wage, which means you're not allowed to pay anyone below a minimum, and it's not $30 an hour, it's 20 something, I forget the exact number at the moment. But there are no additional minimums for any specific types of jobs or occupations. And so in theory, what that means is you might have loads of experience as a chef, you get a job as a head chef in a restaurant, but if you can't negotiate a better salary, the employer could, in theory, pay you minimum wage, the same rate that they have to pay the person washing the dishes. Whereas in Australia, they can't do that. There are rules. So that's what we see as a little bit more attractive about Australia. Now, what's happening coming up soon? Changes in policy. In Australia, policy changes all the time. Case law changes all the time. Immigration, let's say appeals, is probably one of the largest area of the appellate courts. Barristers, lawyers who work with appeals at the ART and the judicial reviews, they're very busy. New Zealand, on the other hand, policies don't change so frequently, right? They change less frequently. They receive updates and tweaks. But when they do change, they're reasonably comprehensive. And so, whereas I'm not going to talk so much about any specific changes coming up for Australia, because like I say, they're always changing and amending and adapting. In New Zealand, coming up in August this year, there is a reasonably major change for the skilled migrant category. It's becoming, I guess you could say, easier for many occupations, but what they're doing is they're bringing in blocks and roadblocks for certain other occupations that have had, let's say, visa or immigration abuse in the past. As an example, some hospitality roles, retail, where people have inflated job offers, claiming to be the manager of a restaurant, but really just an assistant or a waiter, claiming to be a chef when really the job is actually more like just making sandwiches. So certain roles are being restricted, but they're being offered pathway towards residence if you can meet certain more strict criteria, such as a longer amount of work experience in the country and a higher level of pay for a certain period of time. So that's something to watch out for in August. It's potentially going to be a lot easier for a lot of people. Previously, where people who didn't have a bachelor degree would struggle to get to residence, there's now an option under the skilled work experience pathway that's coming in August. Details to follow, of course. The policy's not been released. All we have is announcements, but that's something that's coming. Now, okay, a common question that we hear is that it's difficult to find a job in New Zealand and that it's difficult to get to PR in Australia. And I would say that that's kind of true to a degree, that it might be easier to find a job in Australia, but harder to get to PR, whereas it's harder to find a job in New Zealand, but once you've got one, it's easier to get to your PR. So it's sort of an inverted ratio there. But there's one thing I would say about this. Look, on the Australia side, okay, the key point is just to make sure that you're working on a proper pathway, that you're not just going on hopes and dreams and just, advice from your cousins and friends, right? If you've got proper advice, you're doing the right thing, not trying to take the easy way out, you can get there. And then with New Zealand, what I would say is that New Zealand suffers from a little bit of negativity sometimes amongst the people. Sometimes people are a bit dry in their outlook on life. That's just a reality. And when people talk about the economy, they say, the New Zealand economy, this and that. Well, look, if you go out there and get a job, and then you tell your friend, I got a job, and then your friend goes, how'd you get that? And you say, well, I just did. I did this and I did that. And the friend says, well, I've tried all those things and I didn't get a job. Now, one of them is going to say, there are jobs out there because I got one. The other one's going to say, you can't get jobs because I didn't get one. So which one's right? Who's right? Okay, they're both right because they both got what they feel is the case and to exist in the world. I guess, without going into airy-fairy talk about positive thoughts and manifesting your dreams, the reality is that you either get what you're looking for or you give up. And of course, sometimes giving up is appropriate. If you try so hard to get a job and you can't get one and you have to leave the country, okay, fine. But no, there are jobs out there. Employers are hiring. It's just that they might not hire you right now. Maybe they'll hire you tomorrow. Maybe another employer will hire you right now or tomorrow. You've got to keep trying. Stay positive. And there's one thing to keep in mind, that New Zealanders are leaving the country in really large numbers, often to Australia. And a lot of those New Zealanders themselves were migrants who obtained citizenship. I think it's something like 50% of new citizenship applications in Australia from New Zealanders are from New Zealanders who were not born in New Zealand. And so people are leaving, skilled people are leaving for better opportunities in Australia, which means there's a gap here that needs to be filled. And I suppose you could say that the more people that come in to fill those gaps, the more the economy will grow and boost, and therefore the more jobs that will become available. All right, so cost, timing, and a reality check. What does it cost to migrate? It actually costs a lot, okay? Comparing New Zealand and Australia, I would say that Australia is more expensive. You're going to pay more to study at the universities. You're going to pay more for the application fees, sometimes double by comparison to New Zealand. It may take you longer, a process to get there in Australia. Whereas in New Zealand, their education system here is a little bit cheaper. The application fee's considerably cheaper. Just as an example, yesterday in this conversation with the chef I was talking with, in Australia, he said that to apply for the work visa, it was like $15,000 or $16,000 altogether of the application fees and costs with the employer. Whereas in New Zealand, we added it all up, even if the employer needed to do accreditation and the job check application, and then he would do the work visa. Altogether, that's $3,000. So that's a considerable difference. The thing to really keep in mind though is that it does take time, it does cost money, and you need to plan and have a good strategy, okay? Because there's no guarantee of approval. There is no guarantee. Every application must meet specific legal criteria, and the decision always rests with the immigration officer, the decision maker, and they have discretion. That's something that you can't control. So as a piece of final advice, look, my advice is simple, okay? The first thing I always say to everyone is get advice. So my advice is to get advice, get good advice. But besides that, you need to understand your profile realistically, get a holistic picture of who you are and what you're doing. Don't rely on assumptions or just free online advice, okay? Be really careful about anyone offering free advice, because it's never free. You pay the cost when that person offering the free advice hasn't taken into account your full circumstances. Get proper guidance early. Plan your entire pathway, not just the next step. Okay, we're playing chess here. You want to see 5 moves ahead, because migration is not about finding the easiest country. It's about finding the country that best fits your profile. Yep, and it's about being the person that country needs and wants. So look, if you're unsure about which country to go for or what pathway suits you best, get a proper assessment. Feel free to reach out with us. We can guide you based on your individual profile. Talk to someone who knows what they're doing, and good luck.